Well, hello and welcome to A Dad Talks to Dads. My name is Anthony Almodovar, and I am a member of the Adrian First Baptist Church. We are doing a series on raising our children in a challenging culture in a biblical way. And we are utilizing a book by J.C. Ryle, and he has 17 principles that he has given to us. And so we're going through each one of those. So if you're already familiar with this podcast, we're just going to kind of jump right into it and start off. So we're on principle number 9: train your children to develop a habit of obedience. Now, this particular principle really lines up with principle number 8 when we talked about training your children in the habit of faith. And I see these two as inseparable, two inseparable, I'm sorry, uh, an inseparable combination. In other words, these two go hand in hand. They can't separate one from the other. It's kind of like separating the wet from the water. Okay, um, this is obedience is part of faith, and faith is a part of obedience, and they have their interactions, and they demonstrate the exact same thing or the same goal, and that is its loyalty and its attention to whom they are obeying in faith, and that is God, and that's what we're after. And so we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because I really talked a lot about obedience in principle number 8 in regards to faith, but we'll cover I think what is the main focus on this particular principle. And this is what J.C. Ryle says. In his estimation, he says that it is visible faith, acting faith, and personified faith. It is the test of real discipleship among the Lord's people. In other words, it's what I said again in Principle 8. Obedience is the substantive uh, outcome or the demonstration of faith. It demonstrates who and what and why we act and do what we do. It's because of God and what He's asked of us to do, and we obey based on that. And so, so again, it's the they're inseparable, faith and obedience, and that is a good thing because this also goes into the how can I say uh, the the point that I've made before in previous podcasts about sometimes we raise our children out of it, for behavioral modification. We just try to make them you know these behavioral obedient children um, just for the sake of being obedient and being good, so to speak, morally good, and those are not bad things. However, this obedience is supposed to be about a demonstration of our faith and our faith in whom, and that is God. And that's what we're after here when we're raising our children. So I'm going to use two scriptures that I used in the previous podcast because I think they again it demonstrates the faith and the obedience working together, and and so we'll go to those scriptures. And the first scripture is the one I used back for Genesis. It talked about Adam and Eve and God telling them to obey and not eating the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And obviously, we know what happened from there. We know that they disobeyed in this, and this is going to come down to down the line as far as when I start talking about what we should be gleaning from this. But obviously, um, their actions demonstrate their lack of trust in God and what He says that if you eat from this, that you shall surely die. And here the serpent was saying, "Well, you're not going to die. Nothing's going to happen to you because God knows what's really in it for him." This is not for your benefit. This is for him, and that's not untrue in the sense of it is about God. It's about glorifying God. However, Adam and Eve were benefiting if they stayed in obedience with God. And that's the very thing that they lost. As a matter of fact, their loss became our loss. It obviously we inherited this, and now we're paying the price because death has entered because of sin. And so now we have corruption, and we have the things that we do that we shouldn't be doing from our lack of obedience in faith to God. So the other scripture um, that I spoke about in podcast number 8 was the one about Abraham. Now this is on the positive note. Okay, now this one I really like in the sense of, for the story of Abraham, there were a lot of smaller stories leading up to this that showed Abraham's obedience to God, demonstrating his faith, and sometimes he didn't do so well, and sometimes he did do well. Like, he didn't do so well the first time in having a child with Hagar. That was bad. Okay. And then there was times where he delivered Lot, from the hands of Sodom and Gomorrah, and that was good. He obeyed God as far as where to go, and that was good. And so we see things, and this is good. And I say that because these are really good illustrations to share with your children to show um, that not the examples of what happens when you obey and when you disobey, but also that it is a process. It is a development. It just doesn't happen right. You don't obey perfectly from the get go. You just don't get it right the first go. However, and this demonstrates the leading of where Abraham's heart lands when he finally gets to the point of obeying God in a very extreme command, and that was to sacrifice his only son. And that's man, I if only I can't imagine what that must have felt like. However, whatever it was, Abraham was able to obey. And Abraham was at the place in his life, in the long years that he was walking with God, he finally came to obeying God in such a way that demonstrated that his heart was and life was totally towards God. And that's what we want for our children. We want them to be devoted to him. Not again, I'm not against good behavior and teaching our children to behave well and have manners and respect for others. However, I think it's important that we anchor that and we make sure we tie that to the principles that God has established. In other words, that we respect because of God, that we respect other human beings, and that we behave and we have manners because we respect God and we think that highly of God. Okay, so that's what I'm after. But here's the one that the scripture I like to point out to, and this is Proverbs. And what I like about Proverbs is it really does well in teaching us how to help our children obey. This comes out of Proverbs chapter 6, verse 20-23. And I'm just kind of concising this because there's so much in Proverbs 6 that says, well, I don't know how to fit that all. And I don't want to go on and on. And again, these podcasts, I want to try to keep them, concise and poignant. But here I just want to demonstrate something that as parents, we should be doing. And that is, we should be helping, instructing our children to understand, like Isaac understood, that Abraham his father was getting, he was obeying God, and Isaac was seeing how God was to be obeyed and should be obeyed, and that's what Isaac saw. And I said in that last podcast 8, that we are the tutorials of faith, that we are the ones that God places the command upon, according to Ephesians. Fathers instruct your children the way they should go, according to, in the Lord, um, and that's on us, and we're the tutorials, and we have that responsibility. whether we like that or not, and whether it's something we'd rather not do or not do. It's not a matter of choice. It comes with the package. It's part of God's government, I should say, in the way that He has designed things, or His design, I should say. But let me read this Proverbs chapter 6. My son, observe the commandment of your father, and do not forsake the teaching of your mother. Bind them continually on your heart, tie them around your neck. When you walk about, they will guide you. When you sleep, they will watch over you. And when you awake, they will talk to you. For the commandment is a lamp, and the teaching is light. Now, this is a father talking. And again, in ancient times, this is what Proverbs is not unique to the Hebrew nation, or the Hebrew people. Um, Many nations, many other societies, the Philistines and the Amorites, they all have proverbs. Egyptians had proverbs that they all lived by. Okay, this is not unique. However, it was a way of um, how can I say, transitioning or teaching um, the children as for future generations, and handing down and how one should live. Um, oh, my battery is about to go dead. Hold on, I need to pause this. All right, sorry about that. It was a little embarrassing, but hopefully that doesn't cause too much of a glitch. Otherwise, I'm going to have to do this all over again. But that's okay. Um, Again, this is a Proverbs that was trying to help children understand how they should live, and why they live the way they should. And again, Proverbs for us in the Bible is directed towards God. It's a lifestyle that we should have that is directed and designed by God, and that's what the Father's trying to convey to the children and teach them and instruct them. And in Proverbs, what I like is there are specifics in regards to in the instruction and the outcome that can be expected when when we don't obey. Okay, so for an illustration of instruction, for example, there are a lot of good nature illustrations that proverb uses, like for example the ant. you know, Broward uses the ant to demonstrate, you work hard, look how diligent they work, and look how successful they are, as opposed to the sluggard, okay, who doesn't get much done, and it just is very slothful, and nothing's really being produced by this creature. But in this specific one, this proverb is trying to demonstrate, if you listen to me, okay, this is why you are to listen to me. And we'll go to the next verse. And it says, this is to keep you from the evil woman, from the smooth tongue of the adulteress. Now, in Proverbs, the evil woman or the adulteress is almost assimilated to the world, if not exactly assimilated to the world. In other words, the world is very subtle. It's very seductive, and it has its way of um, wrapping itself around not only us but our hearts and our minds. And what Proverbs is trying to say in to the son, or to the daughter, to the child, do not, listen to what I'm saying, and bind them, because it's going to help you guard against the subtlety. And look how at the end it says, it is a lamp, and I'm sorry, it for the commandment is a lamp, and the teaching is light. In other words, it's going to be able to help you expose when the world is trying to get you to obey them rather than God. And that's going to help me jump into my example here. And um, the best illustration for this, I think, is in Daniel. Um, One of the things that I think we kind of gloss over in the book of Daniel. I remember doing a podcast, and we talked about prayer and using and how Daniel prayed. However, there were a couple of situations there where Daniel was asked to obey um, his captors. As a matter of fact, he was asked to obey all the time. Matter of fact, one of those reasons he was asked to, when we talked about his praying, he was asked to, um, do something that it was against God's will and God's way of doing things for His people. And we found Daniel in this position a lot, in the sense of we saw him in, he had to, he they asked him to eat the meat sacrificed to gods. We saw that he was asked to bow down a couple of times. Got him tossed into the lion's den. Um, got him tossed into a fiery furnace. And my point is this: Daniel was placed in a situation where the world was getting was telling Daniel, you need to obey us if you want to live. You need to do it our way if you want, to continue your type of lifestyle. And isn't that what the world tells us? If you do it our way, you'll be better off. Otherwise, you're out of here, or to the point of you're not only out of here, we're going to kill you. Okay. And you're going to die. And the world is at this point in our culture in this day and age, that's where this is, some of this people or organizations are getting to, is the fact of you're no longer relevant, because if you don't obey and do it the way we want you to do it, then why are you here? We might as well get rid of you. And that's what Daniel faced. But notice how Daniel responds. Daniel responds in obedience to God. Now, again, he was a very young man at that time, and that didn't happen, just overnight for him. He was instructed, I'm sure, by the tutelage of his parents and the environment that he was before they were captured. It says that Daniel had wisdom beyond his age, and that he was, God, was impressed upon his heart. Okay, but again, I just want to show that in Proverbs, the father is trying to help the child understand, as Daniel understood, that the God's command is just not about just the obedience, but it's about the preservation of the proper life that we should be living in relationship to God and in the world that we live in. And that God um, has our protection over us, and He is with us when we're obeying, as He was with Daniel. And so again, I don't want to belabor the point, but the fact is that we need to be able to distinguish whether we're teaching our children a worldly type of obedience rather than a biblical type of obedience. And that's my main focus and my main point. And I'm using Daniel as an illustration to say, he had a biblical or a godly frame of mind in how to obey God and what to do, and he did it. And we saw the outcomes of that. And that's what Proverbs really helps. So I highly suggest, and really recommend that, as parents, read Proverbs, and look how instruction was demonstrated, and how it was expressed, and how it was taught. It really has a lot of good examples in there, and so I think it'll be a very good help for you in doing that, as well as the rest of Scripture. So again, my kind of just addressing this point as we close here. Use the Bible, use the people of the Bible to illustrate the rewards and the pitfalls of obedience and disobedience. Okay, that's my only point here. Um, there's really not much, and this is again going to be helpful. I mean, there's going to be times when you can um, have certain situations happen in your life and you have that, life lesson, so to speak, or that learning moment where something's happened in your life or something's happened to somebody else, but try to connect it to the principles that God is setting for us or desiring us to carry out in our own lives. So in other words, you may have situation family and you can or in somebody else's life or something happening in the world, and then you could point to your children and you say, see, this is what happens, or this is an example of what God is saying why we should not do these things, or this is why we should do these things from these certain outcomes. And you can bring it back and anchor it back into the scriptures in some way. But my illustration here, sorry about that. My illustration here is that um, try to look at the people in the Bible for your children to look at, so they just don't look at the Bible as just a series of stories, but they start to have a connection because they are the scriptures, they are the words that God has given us to live by. And so I think it'd be pertinent for us to use the examples and illustrations God has given to us already, to help our children and guide them in and instructing them to be obedient to God. So here's the question: are you using the world's standard of obedience or God's? Okay. Um, Again, I'm not trying to come down hard on anybody. I just think that sometimes the world has a way of as to us as parents say, well, maybe you should ease up or you should compromise here or not do this. And we need to be careful of that. We need to make sure that we're teaching our children obedience to God, what God's way. And so again, if we hold on to using the examples and illustrations of obedience, um, from the Bible and from the people for the Bible, I think we'll be in very, 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 very good shape. All right. If you have any questions or comments, please email me at Dad Talks to Dads, FBC Adrian MN at gmail.com. Until next time, God bless and see you then.